Sahana Bhavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahe Tejasvinavaditam Astu Ma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May that one protect us both. May that one nourish us both. May our study be full of vigor and energy. May we work together with that, and may our study be full of illumination. May we not unnecessarily cavil with each other. Peace, peace, peace be on all. So this is a continuation of Katha Upanishad, and we have started really a new section, because even though it is the first chapter, as it were, the subsection, section 2, is to do with where do we start on a spiritual journey. And the stanzas 1 to 9 are dealing with this subject. In summary, one word is necessary, and that is viveka, that is discernment. We have to have the capacity to see things in a new light. What is meant by a new light is the old way of looking at things is to take things at face value and respond to them. But that gives us a lot of trouble. It doesn't really give us a lasting formula for dealing with practical difficulties and issues and obstacles in life. So already there has been 2 options presented to Nachiketa. And this now is represented more specifically. Supposing you are going through a forest area and you're not quite sure whether to go left or right on a path. Or if you're in a maze and you don't know which way to turn, it's only because you don't have sufficient information. So in order to discern correctly, it strikes me that we need more information. We need to be informed about the universe. At some point in life, relating to the world just through the sense organs, taking the world in a materialistic way, we get knock after knock after knock. And it reminds me of the story there in the Nivedita Upanishad, with the 2 birds on a tree. And I may have repeated this story last week, I don't know. So the one bird on the tree is shining, perfect, radiant, blissful, standing at the top, surveying everything, witnessing everything. But the one at the bottom is something like a bird in Irish Blackberry season, around about this time of year. Just by looking at blackberries, I'm not sure if you can tell whether it is exceedingly sour or whether it is sweet. But the aim is to get a sweet thing. So we want the sweetness in life. We want pleasure in life. We have taken the biological impulses for survival and refined them. Instead of just eating in order to keep the body alive, in order to be successful, propagating the species, which is really what is success as is seen in modern Darwinian understanding of things, then we heighten these 2 pleasures, eating and the sex impulse, and make these a refined thing, make these somehow cultural. So instead of just eating to sustain the body, we go to a nice restaurant. And the remarkable thing about a restaurant is if you want to go and have tea in a hotel, they'll put you under a very fancy cut glass chandelier. You drink your tea and have scones or whatever it is, in normal times that is, and you pay a lot of money. You could easily just make tea at home. But then when you go into the restaurant area, you pay much more money. And they take away the chandelier and give you a crude candle instead. You're paying much more money for that much less facilities. That's the funny part about it. So it is with all the senses. We feel that life should be good, and we base our life strategy on this idea. But sooner or later, going back to the analogy of the two birds on the tree, the bird on the lower levels is looking for the best fruit. And the strategy is tasting the bitter and sweet fruits of life, you can put it like that. Inevitably, we don't know. If we're not able to discriminate properly, we don't know what is sweet and what is sour. And so life is a series of experiments to see where do we get this lasting sweetness from. And then we get one fruit which is more bitter than all the rest. Typically, it's bereavement. And that gives us a jolt and allows us to be inspired towards something higher, something different. And so the bird on the lower rungs of the tree looks up and sees the perfect, blissful bird standing on the top, and spontaneously attracted to that and moves toward it. But then suffers from forgetfulness again because the old habitual formula is still in place. In this way, it progresses up the tree. And finally, when it's just near the top, the last attraction, the last magnetic impulse is there toward the bird that seems much more serene, much less erratic than my search for happiness. And there I discover, I was that perfect bird after all. I was always that radiant bird. That was my actual nature, but I forgot it. So this forgetfulness is what we're suffering from. In every spiritual path and every religion, these two distinctions are made between good and bad, or good and evil. And we know that morally we have to do good and we have to avoid evil. But it's much more subtle than that. Because we can think that we're doing good, but all the philanthropic work in the world doesn't really necessarily purify the mind. And that is the purpose of it. How can we purify the mind in such a way that we get a vision of God in theological terms, or access to the eternal truth in philosophical terms? What is that is necessary? So there's a key formula to the good and the bad. And we have to also acknowledge that both are binding. Both are binding. And the universe is a relationship between all these two different forces, without which nothing in the universe works or runs. In order to understand what is good, we have to contrast it. In order to understand what is light, we have to experience the darkness. So that goes along hand in hand. We can visualize it as this yin-yang diagram, where there is a mutual dependency and a mutual cooperation and integration between these two things. And wherever we look, we see what it calls pairs of opposites. Good and bad, plus and minus, positive and negative. So all of those forces are in place. So it seems to be that to go along two paths is for two different purposes. Fundamentally, they are both similar, because good comes to those who follow the good path, and pain comes to those who follow the bad path, the pleasurable path as it's delineated. But they think that they will get this pleasure. That's the dichotomy of it. You're going along the pleasurable path in order to get pleasure, but what you get is only something temporarily so, no doubt, followed by pain. So there's a pleasure-pain syndrome that is always going on. So these two paths are clearly different, and yet they have something similar in mind, that they both want some version of pleasure. One delineated as bliss and the other one delineated as a temporary pleasure, which doesn't really fully work. So the stanza goes off like this. It goes, Anyat Shreyo, Anyad Udeva, Riyaste Ube, Nanarte Purusham Simitaha, Tayo Shreya, Adadanasya, Sadhu Bhavati, Iyati radat ya u priya vriniti. The preferable and the pleasurable, they both approach mankind. Plato has this to say. He says, in every one of us, there are two ruling and directing principles, whose guidance we follow wherever they may lead. The one being an innate device of pleasure, the other an acquired judgment which aspires after excellence. Now, these two principles at one time maintain harmony, while at another they're at feud with us. And now one and now the other obtains a mastery. So we can see this struggle. This comes out, of course, in Zoroastrianism very clearly. And many scholars will think that Zoroastrianism was influencing Judaism in the time of the Babylonian captivity. And they got the idea of angels, if you will, or forces of good and forces of evil, angels of light and angels of darkness. And this is, of course, very prominent in all the mythologies within Hinduism. But let me try to summarize. So spiritual life begins really not with any amazing revelations. It begins with a steady discernment about what is good, what is not good. It begins with moral philosophy. And there are many people today who will argue that you don't have to belong to a religion or a church or read any spiritual text or scripture to discover what is morally good and morally bad, because inherently we must know about this. So there are many humanist societies throughout the world that argue the point. We didn't have to learn from Moses or Krishna or Jesus any of these moral values. We can do it without it. The difficulty about that position is, how do you avoid such a thing as consequentialism? That you're only doing it to avoid something. I'll give you an example. Why do we not rob banks? Is it because we believe it is morally wrong to do so? Or is it because we'll get arrested and serve a jail sentence and destroy our whole reputation? Given the opportunity, supposing now all the security in all the banks were removed on the basis that man is inherently morally good, then all your savings will be gone. Those banks will be just decimated. So moral adherence is only maintenance. There's nothing extra that goes with it. Something extra has to be done. And it begins really with where we stand now in relation to the world and how we interpret the world. And there's an inner urge within us for the highest joy, the highest bliss. That acts as a driving force. We may argue it acts as a driving force throughout the whole of nature. As I often say, I've never met anybody who sat down and told me, my goal is to be unhappy. There may be some inference on that, in that from certain cultures who suffer from miserable weather and love complaining. But basically, we all want happiness and we all want to survive. Nobody wants to not exist. Everybody wants to survive, at least that much, and most want to thrive. And when that thriving is not there on the horizon, then we have to change our tactics, sometimes unwittingly, and go into depression. How do we elevate the spirit? By making a right choice in the first place. So the first step in spiritual life is making a conscious choice, whether something is preferable or whether something is pleasurable. And so these two paths are eliminated. And so that passage that I read is translated like this: the preferable and the pleasurable, they approach mankind. That's an interesting turn of phrase. These are both available. How often are they available? I would suggest every second they're available. Second after second they're available. Second after second, the mind is occupied with what we see in front, and we have to make an interpretation about it. And whatever interpretation we make gets settled in the library of the unconscious mind and forms a habit. And that's what's happened throughout the whole evolutionary process. If you were to take a biological genesis version, you'd say in the beginning were bacteria that were operating in sulfur volcanic vents in the Earth's crust. And they produced sulfur dioxide, and they produced throughout the whole atmosphere a whole methane layer that you and I could not survive in. But how is it possible that they should survive? There must be some inherent tendency in them that they should want to live, that they should want to procreate. Procreate means they have the capacity to double their population every 20 minutes. With rod-shaped bacteria, about one micron long, half a micron wide, living in extreme temperatures in thermal vents. The great famous astrophysicist and scientist Fred Hoyle was under the impression that there was a seeding in the earth, on the earth, from asteroids or something of that nature. He gives a very strong and convincing argument, but no real evidence still. It's a good theory that there is panspermia, that is, that there was a seeding of the earth of basic bacterial species through the introduction of meteorites or whatever astral bodies may have fallen to the earth. As astral bodies attack, as it were, and fall on every single planet in the solar system, including the subplanets such as the moon, satellites such as moon. We can see the cratered face of it. So this urge to survive is an inherent tendency, and this is a great mystery, but not really to us, not in terms of this philosophy, because we believe that the fundamental urge is a divine urge that sits within us and wants to express itself. And this urge to express is what we call evolution. An unfolding. Evolution technically is unfolding. It means nothing new is created. You have a piece of paper, you fold it up and you unfold it. You don't get any new paper. It's the same paper, it's just unfolded. The reason why Charles Darwin tended to avoid this term, evolution, in his Origin of the Species. So we have an urge to express our nature, which is blissful, which has the highest joy within it. And our superficial interpretation of the world is, this world is all that exists. That makes us intrinsically materialists, whether we know it, whether we don't, whether we like it, whether we don't. We are materialists dealing with the material world, thinking that all our happiness will come from it. So there's this avenue, and we are faced with this choice moment by moment. On the other side is what is preferable, not immediately obviously pleasurable, but something which will give more of a deeper understanding, will unveil knowledge. And with that unveiling of knowledge and unveiling of truth, we get closer and closer to the ideal of bliss. So both of these approach mankind, and we may add second by second. The person of intelligence, having considered them, most of us don't consider them, separates the two. The intelligent one, that is the person who has really thought it out, really understood, selects the electable in preference to the delectable, the delicious. The non-intelligent one, the one who is dealing with the world in a materialistic way, in preference to the delectable, the non-intelligent one selects the delectable. Why? For the sake of growth and protection of what? Of the body. In other words, survival. And every biological species has it. What makes man superior to any other species then? Not just this morality, but this very, very astute division this very astute selection of what should be the proper driving force, what should be chosen. Prosperity here and hereafter. So previously, I had described this example from the Mundaka Upanishad of these two birds on the tree. By now you're familiar with the story, but this aptly illustrates the choice that we have. Now, when we don't make any choice, if you allow the mind to run free, then naturally you're not applying this aspect of discernment or discrimination. And why is it expressed as unintelligent to do that? It's because you're not applying any discriminatory intelligence to it. You're simply going with the flow. You're simply going according to any other biological tendency, same as any other animal. You're going according to what we now call instinct, but instinct itself is learned behavior. So when we go back to the bacteria learns. And when things don't work, it adapts and learns again. And that cumulative learning has come through to us as a cooperation or a cooperative of cells that become the human entity. So don't forget, Yama has tested Nachiketa and said, look, you're free to go along with all the pleasures, and has even suggested what pleasures might be given to him, both here and hereafter, by the way. Here and hereafter means that religions don't have the answer if they're saying, oh, the reward is a post-mortem condition called heaven, where you can enjoy all the things in a much better way. And so man's idea about what man misses is replicated in a kind of constructed heaven. For example, in Islam, the ideal of a paradise, a post-mortem condition, is all the things that you miss in a desert. So there has to be spring water, perfumes, lots of fruit, abundances of water. And when you look at the beautiful designs on mosques, on the external walls of mosques, you'll see an attempt to replicate all the highest ideals of the human pleasure, to say this is what you get in post-mortem life. This is the ideal of paradise. Now that is so in every religion, not just a single one. Every religion postulates this, but they still come under this spell of materialism, whether it's here or hereafter. So we can divide everything into these categories of what is pleasurable and what is not. And there are different motives, different objectives. Shrestha prayascha manusyam itastau samparitya vivinakti diraha. Both the good and the pleasant approach man, but the wise person pondering over them discriminates. All right. Then we go on to the next one, Sattvam Priyam. Is that something like Priya Rupam Pamscha Gaman Abhidyayam Nachiketu Jasrakshihi. So, Nachiketa, you such as you are have discarded after consideration all the desirable things that are themselves delightful or are the producers of delight. So you have not accepted this path of wealth, which we call this path of the delight, this prayers, in which many a person comes to grief. In fact, we can even go further and say most people follow it and most people come to grief. You ask, why is there suffering? It's because this path was voluntarily or involuntarily selected. Now it's been said, therefore, that good befalls him who accepts the preferable among these two. He who selects the pleasurable falls from the true end. And so that is what is determined. And so Nachiketa is absolutely suitable to understand this path and this teaching. Don't forget, Yama has attempted to destroy that choice. Life itself suggests that we should follow this path and don't worry about anything else. This really has had an impact. Modernization, we are told, and there's very good evidence for it, that in countries that have become more modernized throughout the world, religion has declined. And countries where modernization is much less, religion is very strong. And before long, most countries will be much more modernized. And if the trend continues, there must be a decline in religion. There are many factors for this. But one factor really is that maybe religions aren't accessing or aren't pointing out this particular path. And they're saying, well, there's no alternative. And religions themselves are suggesting a post-mortem version of the other kind of path. That which is known as knowledge and that which is known as ignorance are widely contradictory. Widely contradictory. And they follow divergent courses. And so Yama is telling, I consider Nachiketa to be an aspirant for knowledge because the enjoyable things, multifarious though they be, did not even tempt him. But why is it that he wasn't tempted? Such a young boy, we estimate about 12 years of age, he wasn't tempted because he saw the temporary materialistic value in these things. And so he himself says, you can offer me anything that you like, no matter how exotic, no matter how amazing, but I have to tell you that none of these would be lasting. And even the deities, the administrative body within the universe, any governing entity or superior entity in another dimension, even these people seeming to enjoy the subtle worlds of heavens, they don't get it either. So they live still with the question, why is there sorrow and grief? That's the fundamental question. So living in the midst of ignorance and considering themselves intelligent and enlightened, that's the interesting thing. In other words, having the ego, I am knowledgeable, I know it all. I heard yesterday, I said I hadn't seen somebody for a long time. And the spouse said, why don't you come along? Oh, what would I know all that, you see. So that's interesting. So these are considered to be senseless people. And then there's a universal expression. I'll tell you why it's universal. Go round and round following crooked courses. And this is mentioned in another Upanishad also. How? Like the blind leading the blind. I think you find a gospel quotation in this way as well. See? So the blind leading the blind under the guise of knowledge. Not only are they themselves deceived, but they lead others into the deception also. So Shankaracharya in his commentary, of course, he suggests that avidya or ignorance is concerned with what is pleasant, and vidya or wisdom is associated with what is good. Now you might follow the one path and still claim that you are morally good, you see. I hope you see the distinction. For even many desires did not distract Nachiketa, and abiding in the midst of this ignorance then, the wise in their own esteem, thinking themselves to be learned. I always remember an interview with a famous Oxford chemist professor, and somebody who's prominent in society said, you see, you can see by the accent that this person is not only prominent, but maybe even royalty. You see, you chaps, he says, you see, you're all very well at saying the how, but not the why. And this chemist's retort, who is also and is a famous neo-atheist, said, Oh, why is just a stupid question. You can see the arrogance, and said with a very arrogant tone, academic arrogant tone. Why is just a stupid question? Well, of course, why in the sense of a past, why not what next is a much better question, but why in the sense of causality, what's causing something and what's causing that is the very essence of the science that this person is espousing. Unfortunately, the person he was having a conversation with didn't pick up on that, and so there was no suitable retort. But we are abiding in the midst of ignorance. That is, we cannot see the truth. It's not our fault, by the way. There's no moral conscience about it. There's no guilt associated with it. It is a fact. It is as it is. That because we are faced with a world that is responding to the interpretation through the sense organs, we take that as our valid world, as our actual world. But the skill is, how do we get out of it? We get out of it through this viveka, through this discernment. I think it is Matthew's gospel that says, if the blind lead the blind, both shall fall into the ditch. Yeah? Okay. Then the next stanza is telling us, is asking a question and answering a question. Well, if this is the case, because of this alone, because of ignorance, the means for the attainment of the other world is not revealed to them. And don't forget, both good and bad are binding us. Both are binding us. But one is a method, a way out. And the way is essentially purifying the mind. So, the means for the attainment of the other world does not become revealed to the non-discriminating person who blunders, befooled by the lure of wealth, wealth as a generic term meaning all sense pleasures, one that constantly thinks that there is only this world and none hereafter, comes under my sway again and again, this is Yama talking, comes under the sway of death. So the goal, therefore, is immortality. Now we have to be careful about the language of this, because when you set out a goal, the assumption is, I haven't got it. But that's not what is meant. What is meant is, ignorance is hiding the fact of your own inner perfection here and now. And a question of peeling away the layers. This is what is necessary. And we start by understanding the principle of it first. The practice of it is catching the emotions up. And so, because it's the emotions that are pulling us away. So if we take these two paths, we can say that the dynamic movement toward the stress, the preferable path, is to do with discerning, using our intellect. But then to actually move along the path, to choose the path, that's the first thing. Then move along the path and keep it going. The emotions have to rally around. I often tell the story, I don't mind telling it 1,000 times just to bore you, but the old story there of somebody, you take somebody and put the person on a summer lawn. Let's say there's a range of about, I don't know, maybe 20 meters even, and you put a plank on the ground about, let's say, 1 meter wide, and you ask the person, I don't know if you have the skill to walk along that. Yes, of course I have the skill. I don't know if you have the skill to skip along it. Yes. What about riding a bicycle? Yes, easy. Then you take that same plank and you put it over a chasm with a 200-meter drop. And you say, on the one side, if you're able to walk across this, I'll give you a huge, huge bag of money. You'll be satisfied for the rest of your life. So give him the normal kind of wealth incentive that this path is proposing. And then you do one thing. You challenge him. You go across that. But before you do it, for 2 weeks in advance, we'll put you in front of a film, you watch it for a few hours every day, of people attempting to do this, actors, and stumbling and falling to their death 200 meters down with appropriate, appropriate cries and so on and so forth that diminish along with the distance. And now you're saying, right, now please do this. You see, it's the same plank that you walked on, that you skipped on, that you ran on, that you bicycled on. There's no difference. But the emotions now have gotten hold of you. That's the problem. So we have to learn to rally the emotions around. Anyway, so one that constantly thinks that there is only this world with the emotional association and reaction to it is my addition. And none hereafter comes under my sway again, that is, comes under death. But among thousands, it is only one like you, says Yamtu Nachiketa, who hankers after the preferable and who becomes a knower of the self. Because if you ask, why isn't it popular? It's very easy. We are sitting in a hall here, which can accommodate probably 50, 60 people under normal circumstances without the social distancing. And if I gave an advertisement about a talk, I'm going to show you how to be wealthy beyond your wildest dreams. We would pack the whole place. But if I say, now I'm going to teach you the Katha Upanishad, I'm going to tell you about how to go along a preferable path that is the opposite, how to reject excess wealth and how to sustain life without entertaining the sense organs in a sophisticated way or otherwise, then I don't think many people will attend. And the evidence of it is that we have here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 people, a dozen people. A dozen people out of the entire population of this area. I don't know what the population is in this particular area, but in Dublin we have over 1 billion people at least, and in Ireland about 4.5, maybe nearly 5 million people. So people will live their so-called normal life and be happy and content. And those who settle into that have just done a maintenance. They have just taken the humanist values and moral values as mere maintenance. They haven't gotten to the absolute crux of the issue. So the self is not certainly adequately known when spoken of by somebody with an inferior knowledge, an inferior person, for it is thought of variously when taught by one who has become identified with it. There's no further cogitation with regard to it. It's a conclusive thing. For it is beyond argumentation, being subtler even than the atomic quantity. This is an amazing, amazing stanza. So this is the 8th stanza that we're dealing with. I realize we have left out the 7th stanza, so we'll deal with that also. Shravana yapi bahu biryo nalabhya shantvatopi brahmavo yam na vidyuhu. He who cannot even be heard of by many, who many even hearing it do not know. Wondrous is he who can teach him, and skillful is he who finds him, and wondrous is he who knows, even when instructed by the wise. So, in other words, that internal self, which is always available to all of us, for the mere hearing to many, and by which many do not understand. Sri Ramakrishna puts it like this: many people have heard about milk, others have seen it, but then the real people who know what milk is are those who drink it and taste it. I'm assuming that we're using examples for people who are not lactose intolerant. So, all right. Nachiketa is obviously complimented in this story by Yama as the seeker of the final bliss is rare among people. And the task is very difficult because the nature of the subject is very subtle. The hidden depths of being are conceived as a great mystery. We stand here and we say, I'm here. Is there a God? And if so, where? And what's his telephone number? And what's his email address? But these philosophers are saying, no, there is an entity that is hidden and subtle, that is your own inner self. If you want to discover that, you have to peel off many, many layers. But if you're not even prepared to do that, if you just take the outer world at its face value, there's not even a starting point. Now, what do we mean by inferior and superior and so on and so forth in this? Let's see what Shankaracharya has to say. He says, the self about whom you ask and is spoken of by an inferior man, that is, by a person who has this worldly understanding, because you can know the principle of it but not understand it. It's just so much words. So somebody can declare it is variously, such as it exists, it does not exist, many opinions about it is there, it's the doer, it's not the doer. And many people will be disputants about this and go into many debates and dialectics. But how again is it well understood? Well, it's being understood because the self, that is denoted by the word anya prokte, when spoken of by a non-different man, that is, by the teacher who does not see duality, who has become identified with this one entity, this fundamental principle that is called Brahman, that is to be revealed by him. So there are many teachers out there and many people who put it in a theological context. There are many people who talk about God, write books about God, but how many have seen God? That's the point. This was Vivekananda's question. Naran coming to see Swami Ramakrishna Paramahansa had asked widely through all the people with great, great reputation who he thought would know the answer to the one question, and he was disappointed. He asked everybody in the areas, have you seen God? Simple question. And everybody was obliged to say, well, no, not exactly. No, I haven't, but I believe. And then he comes and poses the same question to Ramakrishna. Ramakrishna laughs. This is not only have I seen God, I see him now. And I see him more real than you sitting there. And you also can see it. This is the mark of a great teacher, to say, and you also can see him. You too can do it. I'm not special. So this is what is being pointed out. Then we know what is inferior and what is superior. Ramanuja, this is Shankaracharya's point of view, but Ramanuja, he has an understanding, and he feels that this avagatihi is a person gets about the self, or the understanding he gets about the self when taught by one who has realized Brahman is impossible of attainment when taught by a person of inferior capacity. So he agrees to that extent with Shankaracharya, but the language is different because this is not necessarily non-dualistic language. Shankaracharya's language is non-dualistic. He sees the one. Then Madhva, who is a dualist, he says that this understanding means by it that it is inferior teaching when taught by a learned but unintelligent person, for it has been variously understood and so is not easy of understanding, but when taught by one who sees no difference at all, there is no knowledge, not even of an inferior kind. It is subtler than an atom, and so cannot be perceived. It is not to be understood by reasoning. Now, this whole question of subtler than an atom is an interesting one, because the atomic theory has only been known comparatively recently. It was the great scientist Boltzmann who dared to suggest that there was such a thing as tiny, tiny things called atoms. And he was mercilessly ridiculed by his peers, by his scientific peers, to the point of his own suicide. They said, this is an old Greek idea, and so we'll have no business with it. We don't want to go back eons. We are modern people. So this is how science shifts and changes, of course, as we develop and grow and increase our understanding. But in the old days, we find the Vaisheshika school of philosophy, that is a Vaisheshika Darshana. That school is entirely to do with the atomic world. So even in these ancient days, they had some idea of the subtleness and the atomic nature of things as a fundamental physical component, and making a comparison with this. Now we'll go on then to the 9th stanza. The 9th stanza will tell us that, and this will be the last of the series in terms of these two parts. Naisha talkina motir apaneya prokratan ye naiva sutnyanyaya prishna and then yam tom apas satya dritye bhatasi tvadrana no bhuyan nachiketa prashta. The wisdom that you have, O dearest one, which leads to sound knowledge when imparted only by someone else other than the logician, is not to be attained through argumentation, debate, not to be done through dialectics. You are, O compassionate one, endowed with true resolution, Yam tells Nachiketa, and may our questioner be like you. May every questioner be like you, full of faith. This is not blind faith. This is unwavering conviction in the teacher, also in the rationale of what is being taught, and in the superiority of the teacher as one who is a knower of Brahman. So the kind of questioner that Nachiketa is, Nachiketaha, is what is sought. We'll go on to the 10th stanza, but there is this 1 to 9 that has told us about these two different divergent paths as a beginning in our spiritual life and spiritual understanding. We'll introduce this, though, the next subject, as a precursor to next week. Since I know that this treasure is impermanent, for that permanent entity cannot be attained through impermanent things. Therefore, knowingly, did I pile up the Nachiketa fire with impermanent things, and have thereby attained relative permanence. We're going back to the second wish, the Nachiketa fire, just to make sure that there is no misunderstanding, that post-mortem condition that enjoys the merits of activities is not the kind of immortality we're discussing here. That has to be made very clear. Mere reason, unassisted by faith, cannot lead to illumination. And so, may we find an inquirer like thee, is Yam's appeal, generally on the basis of Nachiketa's faith and purity of mind, and his discernment of the two paths. And it's not only the pupil who is in search of the teacher, but the teacher is also in search of the pupil, not to make a conversion, not to impart knowledge, but to have a generosity of spirit, whereby all beings have this, at least the opportunity of a certain realization. Now I mentioned that every second is an opportunity to make a discernment between two paths and that these are presented to us. This is what our text says that we have just read. And so we have to play a kind of game. We have to see what is the condition of the mind and the thoughts going through it at any moment, and be able to stand back and assess that correctly and see whether it is in line with prayers or whether it is in line with stress. And then to redirect our mental energy toward the preferable, the path toward bliss. Now, if you do this with a sense of difficulty, struggle, and guilt, moral guilt, then you're actually putting in negatives which will have their consequence, because the reason why these two paths will have a consequence is every action, including psychological action, will produce its result. Every negative thought you put in, supposing you say, in spiritual life, I want a vision, or I want growth, or I want, to be a better person, and so on. On the surface, it sounds very noble, but there's always a bracketed version. I haven't got it. And to say to the Lord of the universe, please forgive me, once should be enough. When you go and post a letter, you don't do it multiple times. You don't wait there for the postman to collect it. Follow him to the sorting office. Make sure it's gone off by airmail. Take a passenger seat. You may as well have delivered it yourself. So faith means that we do it once with the pure conviction that everything is now not only pure and clean, but the next second is a blank check, is an opportunity to put something glorious in it, to assert what a glory as opposed to what a pity. So while there has to be an assessment of your status quo, that's only the precursor to making an informed decision. What will I fill the next second with? And the next second, and the next second. And it's as quick as that. Because if we leave the mind free, such as in idle moments, let's say brushing the teeth. Well, brushing the teeth, you let the mind wander here and there. It's finding its own course without any direction, and the course will always be in tune with the habit level which is existing. You take that and direct it in a glorious way, bringing in elements of adoration, wonder, and thankfulness in every second. Soon, you'll have reformed a habit level with a new habit. Not only have you made a distinction between these two paths, but you have now inserted something that involves the emotions. And you're making a move then that is the second step really to reforming the mind. Good and bad, the preferable and the pleasurable, both of these are binding. Don't forget, both of them are binding. We have to learn to transcend both of them. And we do that by using the one, Ramakrishna example, if I have a thorn in the foot, I take another thorn and to remove it with that same thorn. So we use nature in order to master nature, learning where it cooperates with us and learning when to assert our individuality and strength. For example, if you want to get water from a well, and when you lower the bucket into a well, nature is in your favor. It's easy to do it. When you fill the bucket, then you have to go against nature, against gravity, by pulling it up. In this way, you're able to discern what is the right thing to do in different circumstances. And it is not, and the definition of morality is superbly given by Swami Purnananda. It's to do with strength. Anything that weakens the overall inclusively is obviously immoral. Anything that applies and gives strength to all inclusively is the highest moral position. Assuming that there is subjective morality available to us as well as objective morality. This discussion between is there are subjective or objective morality is really a false one. Both are there, both are present. There are objective moral precepts, there's no doubt, that everybody instinctively adheres to. Obviously there. But there are other more difficult moral questions. For example, when we take the question of, say, abortion, or whatever it is, then, and we're in some kind of moral dilemma, and we don't want direction if it is legalistic. We want to make our own minds up about it. Then the criteria will be, what is the highest moral position? That is, what is the position that will give all-inclusively the maximum strength? So the golden rule has a flaw in it. Do unto others as they would have done, do unto you. Well, if you're somebody in the inner city taking heroin injections, they would want you also to take heroin injections. They want to do to you, what they want you to do to them. We had a series of talks at the Trinity College some years ago, and the chapel there in the Church of Ireland, the chaplain, he decided every Sunday there should be a talk on the golden rule from different perspectives. And of course, the obvious thing is, he who makes the rules gets the gold. Yeah, no, that's not it, okay? But the idea of inserting pain is a good idea. So he who does something to another which produces pain, if they were to do it back to you, that's a good criteria. That avoids a confusion. So if you say, is it moral or immoral to take heroin? Does it weaken society? Does it weaken the person's physique? Does it weaken them mentally? Does it detract from tourism? What is its effect? Do we have to have special institutions for rehabilitations? So is it generally weakening? If it's generally weakening, then we should avoid it. So when we take the path of pleasure, this is a good criteria to apply to it. Is it going to weaken me? Is it weakening my resolve? Is it weakening my willpower? Is it creating disease? And the obvious thing is chocolate cake. So chocolate cake, it's absolutely delicious. And chocolate is one of those things that gives us a serotonin buzz. And so people get nicely addicted to it. But the consequence could well be diabetes. The consequence could well be overweight. And it's no secret that physically obese people or overweight people will also suffer potentially from heart problems, blood pressure, diabetes, all kinds of things. So it's a fool that inserts toxic poison into their bodies under the pretext of pleasure. I couldn't put it more plainly than that. So we leave that off now. We pick it up next week. So I said it would be interactive and I haven't given you a chance. So I'm going to release the microphone and keep quiet while you, if there are any final comments on these 9 stanzas.
Thank you, Swamiji, for the talk. Can I ask one question? It sometimes feels like the 9th stanza is almost a precursor to all the stanzas, or I understood it really wrong.
Well, the 9th stanza is really saying, it's not a precursor to the former ones. Are you saying a precursor to the ones which follow? Is that what your question is?
No, clearly I have to understand it better, but I meant 1 to 8, precursor to those.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, you see, Nachiketa has the wisdom enough to choose the right path, the right understanding, having rejected the rest. So there's that. And so that will lead to sound knowledge, no doubt, yes. So in that sense, yes. when it is imparted by somebody other than a logician, it has an impact. In other words, if you're just using the logic about it, it's not going to work. Why? Because, as I say, in a contest between reasoning and logic and emotions, emotions will always win. So some extra dimension has to be there. You can't do it by applying argumentation. You see, if you're making an argument about the whole of the materialist world, there are tons and tons of debates on this. If you go to YouTube, you'll find a wealth of debates on the subject in the guise of atheism versus theism. That you'll find. So it won't be found from that. But Nachiketa's quality is not just faith, it's also compassion. So Yama is calling him, O compassionate one. That thing is inserted. Endowed with true resolution. Two things are there. You have to have the emotional background to it, the emotional quality in order to understand this. And you also have to have determination that it doesn't waver. You resolve, I'm going to find the answer to this and I'm going to apply it. Both of these things have to be there. So any questioner, when I ask are there any questions, any questioner will have to have at least those two qualities. So there's a misunderstanding sometimes that by using discrimination and the intellect, we are being intellectual. That's not the meaning of it. We're just applying a discriminative faculty, that's all. So there's more than this. In a sense, you're right. In a sense, it's a precursor to the others, but it's being more specific. It's saying, in order to even consider this question, you have to understand that you have to have a purified intellect. It is not a question of being intellectual. When we say a person is a fool or a person is wise, we're not saying a person is clever or not. The cleverest people on the planet, the most intellectual people on the planet, do not understand or know this because they're intrinsically materialist and they have already chosen their way. So these two qualities are absolutely necessary for any student. All right, good. So we leave it there. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.